It's 7 a.m. and you're still in bed. Get up and make me excellent breakfast, my wife yelled, slapping me across the face. After I lost my job. You can't be jobless and be useless, she said. It was then I decided to teach her a lesson. Let me tell you something about waking up to a slap across the face at 7 in the morning. It's not exactly what they put on those motivational Instagram posts about starting your day right. But there I was, sprawled across what used to be our king-size bed, when Clara's perfectly manicured hand came flying across my cheek like I was some deadbeat in a daytime soap opera. The sting was sharp, sure, but what really got me was the way she stood there afterward, hands on her hips, looking at me like I was something she'd scrape off the bottom of her designer heels. You're still in bed? Get up and make me breakfast, she yelled, and I swear to God, her voice could have cut glass. Her face was twisted up in this expression of pure disgust, like she'd just found out I'd been secretly collecting toenail clippings or something equally revolting. But no, my crime was much worse in Clara's eyes. I had the audacity to be unemployed and horizontal at the same time. 3 weeks. That's how long it had been since Norcrest Logistics decided they didn't need a logistics coordinator anymore. 3 weeks since they handed me that pathetic severance check and a "we're restructuring" speech that basically translated to "don't let the door hit you on the way out, champ." And in those 3 weeks, my dear wife Clara had transformed from the woman who used to bring me coffee in bed on weekends into this shrieking harpy who treated me like I was some kind of freeloading roommate she couldn't wait to evict. You know what's funny? Well, not funny haha, more like funny in that twisted, ironic way that makes you want to laugh and cry at the same time. For 8 years, I'd been the provider in this relationship. I was the guy who worked 60-hour weeks so Clara could go back to school for her MBA. I was the one who paid the mortgage, bought her that shiny BMW she loved to show off to the neighbors, and never once complained when she spent my money on those ridiculous weekend spa trips with her equally obnoxious sister Irene. But apparently, 3 weeks of unemployment was enough to erase all of that history. 3 weeks was all it took for me to go from husband to deadweight in Clara's eyes. And this morning, she made it crystal clear that her patience, what little she'd had to begin with, was officially gone. You can't be jobless and useless, she sneered, and there it was. The line that would change everything. Not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it, with this smug little smirk playing at the corners of her mouth like she was delivering the punchline to a joke only she understood. That's when something inside me snapped. Not like a twig breaking, more like a dam bursting. All those years of taking her crap, of nodding along when she made little digs about my lack of ambition, of pretending I didn't notice when she rolled her eyes at my jokes in front of our friends. All those times I bit my tongue when she talked down to me like I was some kind of mental defective who needed constant supervision. It all came rushing back in that moment, and I realized I was done being her verbal punching bag. See, here's the thing about being married to someone for 8 years. You learn things. You pick up on patterns, notice inconsistencies, file away little details that might not seem important at the time, but could be absolute gold later on. While Clara thought I was just her quiet, compliant husband who wouldn't say boo to a goose, I was actually paying attention. I was watching, listening, and most importantly, remembering. The slap still burned on my cheek as I sat there on the bed, but there was another kind of burning happening in my chest. It wasn't pain or humiliation. It was something much more dangerous. It was clarity. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I could see the situation for exactly what it was. Clara had shown her true colors, and they were ugly as hell. She was still standing there, waiting for me to jump up and start scrambling eggs, or whatever the hell she expected me to do. But instead, I just looked at her. Really looked at her. Took in the way she was dressed in that expensive business suit I'd paid for. The way her hair was perfectly styled, even though it wasn't even 7:30 in the morning. The way she was tapping her foot impatiently, like I was wasting her precious time. Well, she demanded, crossing her arms. Are you going to just sit there like a lump? Or are you going to make yourself useful for once? I could have said a lot of things in that moment. I could have apologized, jumped up, and started making her breakfast like the good little husband she expected me to be. I could have explained that I'd been looking for jobs, sending out resumes, networking my ass off trying to get back on my feet. I could have reminded her that I'd supported her for years without complaint, that maybe showing a little compassion during a rough patch wasn't too much to ask from your supposed life partner. But instead, I just smiled. Not a happy smile, not even a particularly pleasant one. It was the kind of smile you might see on someone who just realized they've been playing poker with a cheater for years and finally figured out where they've been hiding the extra aces. "I'll get right on that," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. Clara must have heard something in my tone that she didn't recognize, because for just a second, her confident smirk wavered. But then it was back, and she was already turning toward the door, probably planning her grand exit. "Good," she said over her shoulder. "And while you're at it, maybe think about what you're going to do with your life. Because this whole unemployed house husband thing, it's not working for me." As her footsteps echoed down the hallway, I sat there in the growing morning light, my cheek still stinging from her slap, and started planning. Not breakfast, screw breakfast. I was planning something much more satisfying. Something that would teach Clara exactly what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness, silence for stupidity, and patience for powerlessness. She thought she held all the cards now that I'd lost my job. She thought she was the one with leverage, with options, with power. But Clara had made one crucial mistake in all her calculations. She'd forgotten that I wasn't just her unemployed husband. I was her unemployed husband who knew all her secrets. 8 years. That's how long I'd been married to Clara. And let me tell you, it's amazing how much bullshit you can endure when you're convinced it's just a rough patch that'll smooth out eventually. Spoiler alert, it doesn't smooth out. It just gets more creative in its ability to make you question your own sanity. When we first got married, Clara was different. Or maybe I was just too blinded by love, or lust, or whatever the hell it was, to see the warning signs flashing like a neon sign at a strip club. She was ambitious, sure, but back then I thought that was sexy. She had goals, dreams, plans for the future that included both of us climbing some imaginary ladder to success together. What a joke that turned out to be. See, Clara had this public persona that was absolutely flawless. I'm talking Martha Stewart meets Oprah Winfrey with a dash of that perfect Instagram mom who somehow manages to look like she stepped out of a magazine even when she's supposedly just running errands. She was polished in a way that made other women hate her and other men wish their wives would take notes. At dinner parties, she'd glide around the room like she was hosting her own talk show, charming everyone with her wit and intelligence, dropping casual mentions of her latest business victories like breadcrumbs for the less successful to follow. Our friends ate it up. "You're so lucky to have Clara," they'd say, and I'd nod along like, "Yeah, I hit the jackpot. She's got it all figured out," they'd add, and again, I'd smile and agree because that's what you do when you're the supporting character in someone else's success story. What they didn't see was what happened when the audience went home and the curtain came down on Clara's one-woman show. Behind closed doors, my wife was about as warm and supportive as a tax audit. Every conversation was a performance review where I somehow always came up short. "Why don't you apply for that promotion?" she'd ask, but the way she said it made it sound like she was really asking, "Why are you such a pathetic underachiever?" When I try to share something about my day, she'd listen with this glazed-over expression like I was explaining the intricacies of watching paint dry. But here's the kicker. I supported her through everything. When she decided she wanted to go back to school for her MBA, who do you think footed the bill? When she needed to quit her job to focus on her studies, who picked up the slack and worked extra hours to keep us afloat? And when she graduated and decided she needed a professional wardrobe that cost more than most people's cars, guess whose credit card got maxed out? That BMW sitting in our driveway? The one she loved to casually mention in conversations like, "Oh, I just need to move my BMW so you can get the garbage cans." Yeah, I bought that too. Not because I'm some kind of materialistic show-off, but because Clara convinced me it was an investment in her professional image. Apparently, financial advisors can't be seen driving anything less than luxury. Who knew? For years, I told myself this was just how marriage worked. You support each other through the tough times, you invest in each other's dreams, and eventually, it all pays off for both of you. I was playing the long game, being the stable foundation while Clara built her empire. I figured once she got established in her career, once we were both in a good place financially, things would balance out. We'd be partners again instead of me being her personal ATM and cheerleading squad rolled into one. But then I lost my job at Norcrest Logistics. and suddenly Clara's true colors came out brighter than a highlighter on white paper. The very first day I came home with the news, her reaction wasn't concern or sympathy or even basic human decency. It was panic. Not for me, but for her. "What are we going to do about the mortgage?" was the first thing out of her mouth. Not, "Are you okay?" or "We'll figure this out together." Just immediate concern about how my unemployment was going to affect her lifestyle. Within a week, the belittling started. Little comments here and there about how I needed to network better or think outside the box when it came to job hunting. She'd make jokes at dinner with friends about how I was exploring my options, but the way she said it made it sound like I was sitting around eating bonbons and watching soap operas all day instead of sending out dozens of resumes and going on interviews. Her sister Irene, and don't even get me started on that piece of work, would come over and they'd have these conversations where they thought they were being subtle, but I could hear every word. "He's really peaked, hasn't he?" Irene would say, and Clara would laugh like it was the funniest observation in the world. "I mean, some people just don't have that drive, you know?" And Clara would nod along like she was talking about some stranger instead of her husband of 8 years. The thing is, while Clara was busy treating me like her personal disappointment, she had no idea that I'd been paying attention to a lot more than just her mood swings. See, when you're married to someone who thinks they're smarter than everyone else in the room, they tend to get a little careless about covering their tracks. Those late nights at the office, I'd started noticing they coincided pretty regularly with a certain coworker named Darren posting Instagram stories from the same restaurants Clara claimed she was working at. Those mysterious charges on her credit card? They lined up perfectly with hotel stays in the city that she'd never mentioned. And those private phone calls she'd taken in the other room? Well, let's just say I'd gotten pretty good at being in the right place at the right time to overhear some very interesting conversations. But here's where Clara really screwed up. She thought I was stupid. She thought that just because I didn't make a scene, didn't call her out on her increasingly obvious lies, didn't fight back when she treated me like garbage, that meant I was clueless. She mistook my patience for ignorance, my silence for acceptance, and my restraint for weakness. What she didn't realize was that I'd been documenting everything. Not in some creepy, obsessive way, more like an insurance policy. Screenshots of suspicious text messages when she left her phone unattended. Photos of receipts that didn't match up with her stories. Voice recordings of particularly brutal conversations where she'd really let her mask slip and show just how little respect she had for me. I had boxes of evidence tucked away in places Clara would never think to look, all organized and dated like some kind of marital crimes database. Every cruel comment, every obvious lie, every piece of proof that the woman everyone thought was perfect was actually a manipulative, cheating fraud. I had it all. After Clara delivered that Academy Award-worthy slap and her little motivational speech about breakfast, she didn't just walk away. Oh no, that would have been too easy. She had to add insult to injury, literally. As she grabbed her designer purse and headed for the door, she threw one more verbal grenade over her shoulder that detonated everything I thought I knew about our relationship. "If you don't get your act together, don't expect to live here for free," she said, not even bothering to turn around and look at me when she delivered this ultimatum. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke, and I just sat there on the bed, my cheek still burning from her slap, trying to process what she'd just said. Live here for free? Live here for free? Let me paint you a picture of just how spectacularly wrong Clara was about this particular detail. When we bought this house 5 years ago, and by we, I mean I, because guess whose name is on the deed? It was my credit score that got us approved for the mortgage. My salary that qualified us for the loan. My down payment that came from the savings account I'd been contributing to since before Clara was even a blip on my romantic radar. But here's the beautiful part. Clara was so busy being the breadwinner for the past few years, so convinced that her fancy financial advisor job made her the queen of our domestic castle, that she'd apparently forgotten some pretty crucial details about our living situation, like the fact that the house deed had my name on it. Just mine. Not both of ours, not some cute joint ownership thing. Just good old-fashioned single-name ownership that would make any divorce attorney do a little happy dance. You see, when we bought the place, Clara was still in school, still building her credit, still basically a financial liability according to the bank standards. So we put everything in my name with the understanding that we'd add her later when she was more established. But then life happened. Clara got busy with her career, and somehow later, never actually arrived. Every month, the mortgage payment came out of my account. Every property tax bill, every insurance payment, every home improvement loan, all of it traced back to me and my supposedly inadequate financial management skills. As I sat there listening to her BMW, the one I bought, did I mention that, roar out of the driveway, I couldn't help but laugh. Not a happy laugh, mind you. More like the kind of laugh you hear in horror movies right before someone does something that'll require a lot of bleach to clean up afterward. Clara had just threatened to kick me out of my own house. My house. The house I'd been paying for while she was off playing financial advisor and apparently playing hide the salami with her coworker Darren. But the house wasn't even the best part of this whole delicious irony sandwich. No, the real cherry on top was all the other stuff Clara had conveniently forgotten in her rush to establish dominance over what she thought was her crumbling marriage. Like my friend Malik, for instance. Clara had always dismissed him as that computer nerd you went to college with. But what she didn't realize was that Malik had turned that computer nerd status into a pretty lucrative tech consulting business. The kind of business that specialized in digital forensics, data recovery, and, most importantly for my current situation, making information go viral faster than a TikTok dance craze. Malik owed me a few favors too. Remember that time Clara insisted we couldn't help him move because she had some important networking event that turned out to be a wine tasting at the country club? Yeah, I still helped him move his entire apartment by myself while Clara was off getting tipsy with her bougie friends. Or how about when his startup was struggling and needed a small loan to keep the lights on? Guess who didn't even hesitate to write that check while Clara was giving speeches about not mixing business with friendship? Yeah, Malik remembered all of that. And Malik had skills that could make Clara's perfectly curated life implode faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Right now, I was still in the afterglow of Clara's spectacular miscalculation, sitting in MY bedroom, in MY house, with MY mortgage payment automatically deducted from MY bank account every month, while she drove off to work in the car I bought her, probably thinking she'd just laid down the law to her deadbeat husband. The more I thought about it, the funnier it got. Clara prided herself on being this sharp, calculating businesswoman who could spot a bad investment from a mile away, but she'd somehow missed the fact that she was living in a house she had no legal claim to, driving a car that was registered in my name, and married to a guy who'd been quietly documenting her affairs and financial improprieties for months. Speaking of which, it was probably time to organize all that evidence I'd been collecting. I walked over to my desk, the one in the home office of MY House, and pulled out the file folder I'd been keeping in the locked drawer. Clara thought it was where I kept old tax returns, which technically wasn't wrong, but it was also where I kept something much more interesting. Screenshots of text messages between Clara and Darren that would make a sailor blush. Photos of them going into hotels together during what Clara claimed were client meetings. Recordings of phone conversations where Clara called me everything but my actual name. Most of them involving colorful descriptions of my character, my manhood, and my general worth as a human being. But the real goldmine was the financial stuff. See, Clara might have been good at her job, but she wasn't quite as good as she thought she was. Those late-night, emergency client calls she'd been taking, some of them were actually her bragging to Darren about how she'd been skimming money from client accounts, funneling their investments into high-risk ventures that paid her bigger commissions, and generally treating her clients' retirement funds like her personal gambling money. I had it all. Every boastful confession, every admission of guilt, every piece of evidence that would not only end her career, but probably land her in some serious legal trouble. The kind of trouble that makes you really appreciate having a house to live in, assuming you're not too busy serving time for financial fraud. But Clara didn't know any of that. In her mind, she was the one holding all the cards, the successful career woman who was finally putting her loser husband in his place. She thought her threat about me living for free was her trump card, the thing that would finally motivate me to get my act together and start groveling for her approval again. What she didn't realize was that she'd just declared war on someone who'd been preparing for battle for a very long time. You know what's absolutely hilarious about people who think they're smarter than everyone else? They get so comfortable in their superiority complex that they start making rookie mistakes a community college ethics student could spot from space. Clara was the poster child for this phenomenon. and her workplace shenanigans at Alder and Finch were about to become Exhibit A in my case for how to destroy your own life through pure arrogance. Clara loved to talk about her job. Not to me directly, of course. That would have required acknowledging my existence as something more than furniture that occasionally needed feeding. But she'd brag to her friends, her sister, hell, probably to the checkout guy at Whole Foods about how she was this ethical financial advisor who really cared about her clients' futures. She'd go on and on about her fiduciary responsibility, her commitment to transparency, and her dedication to building long-term wealth for hard-working families. What a load of absolute horseshit. See, Clara made one crucial mistake in all her years of treating me like background noise. She assumed I wasn't paying attention when she took her private calls. You'd think someone who worked in finance would understand the concept of insider information and keeping sensitive conversations actually, private. But Clara was so convinced of my general uselessness that she'd take calls from Darren right there in the living room while I was watching TV, apparently thinking my brain was too fried by unemployment to process what she was saying. Boy, was she wrong about that. Those late-night conversations weren't just about their sordid little affair, though there was plenty of that gross stuff to wade through. No, the really juicy parts were when Clara would get all giggly and conspiratorial, bragging about how she was maximizing revenue streams and optimizing commission structures, which, translated from corporate bullshit speak, meant she was screwing over her clients harder than she was screwing Darren. I had recordings of her laughing, actually laughing, about funneling some retired teacher's pension money into high-risk cryptocurrency investments because the commission was 3 times higher than the boring, stable bonds the woman had specifically requested. She'll never know the difference, Clara had said, and if it pays off, she'll thank me. If it doesn't, well, that's why they invented fine print. There was the time she bragged about convincing a young couple to take out a second mortgage to invest in some sketchy real estate venture that existed primarily on paper and in the imaginations of the scam artists running it. The commission on that deal apparently paid for that spa weekend she took with Irene, the one where she complained the entire time about how stressed she was from working so hard for ungrateful clients. But my personal favorite was when she told Darren about her little side hustle of skimming extra fees from elderly clients who she figured wouldn't notice or wouldn't complain even if they did. What are they going to do, fire me? Half of them don't even remember what they had for breakfast, let alone what their portfolio fees should be, she'd said. And I could hear Darren laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. Every single one of these conversations was now sitting in my private digital vault, carefully organized and time-stamped like evidence in a federal case. Because, let's be honest, that's probably what it was going to become once the right people heard these recordings. But here's where it gets really beautiful. Clara thought she was untouchable. She'd built this reputation at Alder and Finch as the golden girl, the one who could bring in new clients and keep them happy while generating serious revenue for the firm. She won awards, got her picture in the company newsletter, and was probably being fast-tracked for a promotion that would have made her ego even more insufferable than it already was. What she didn't realize was that all of her success was built on a foundation of fraud that was about as stable as a house of cards in a tornado. And I was about to be that tornado. That afternoon, while Clara was out shopping with Irene, probably spending money she'd stolen from some retiree's nest egg, I sat down at my computer and started crafting the most satisfying piece of correspondence I'd ever written. It was an anonymous report to Alder and Finch's compliance board, and let me tell you, it was a masterpiece of devastating detail. I didn't just dump all the evidence at once like some amateur. No, I was strategic about it. I started with the most damning financial irregularities, the ones that would be easiest for the compliance team to verify. Specific client accounts, exact dollar amounts, dates and times of unauthorized transactions. The kind of concrete evidence that doesn't require interpretation or context, just basic arithmetic and a functioning moral compass. Then I attached selected excerpts from Clara's recorded conversations, the ones where she explicitly admitted to violating her fiduciary duty and laughing about it. I made sure to include timestamps and context, so there'd be no question about what was being discussed or who was saying what. But the real cherry on top was the documentation of her relationship with Darren, because that opened up a whole other can of regulatory worms. Turns out, When you're having an affair with someone who works for a competing financial services firm, and you're sharing confidential client information during your pillow talk sessions, that's what the SEC likes to call a serious fucking problem. I spent hours crafting that report, making sure every detail was accurate, every piece of evidence was properly formatted, and every allegation was backed up by solid proof. By the time I was finished, it read like a prosecutor's wet dream, the kind of ironclad case that makes defense attorneys reach for the scotch before lunch. The best part? I sent it from a completely anonymous email address that Malik had helped me set up months ago. Untraceable, professional-looking, and guaranteed to land in the compliance board's inbox without any way for them to trace it back to Clara's supposedly useless husband. As I hit send, I couldn't help but smile thinking about what Clara's day was going to look like tomorrow. She'd probably waltz into the office with that smug confidence she wore like expensive perfume, ready for another day of screwing over clients and bragging about it to her boyfriend. Instead, she was going to walk into a shitstorm that would make Hurricane Katrina look like a light drizzle. Because when compliance boards get anonymous tips backed up by this much evidence, they don't waste time with gentle inquiries or friendly conversations. They bring in the investigators, freeze the accounts, and start asking the kind of questions that make careers disappear faster than free pizza at a college dorm. Clara thought she was untouchable, protected by her reputation and her results. She was about to learn that reputation is just another word for how far you have to fall, and her results were about to become evidence in what was probably going to be a very public, very career-ending investigation. You know what they say about gut feelings? They're usually right, even when you're desperately hoping they're wrong. For months, I'd had this nagging sensation in my stomach every time Clara came home late. Every time she took those mysterious phone calls in the other room. Every time she suddenly became very interested in working out and started buying lingerie that I never got to see her wear. It was like having a constant low-grade fever that you keep ignoring, hoping it'll just go away on its own. But gut feelings don't pay for divorce lawyers, and they sure as hell don't hold up in court. So while my instincts were screaming that something was off, I did what any rational person would do. I started gathering proof. And let me tell you, Clara made it easier than a paint-by-numbers kit designed for toddlers. The first real evidence came courtesy of pure dumb luck and Clara's complete inability to keep track of her own lies. She told me she was working late on some big client presentation, something about a corporate retirement fund that needed restructuring. Real boring stuff, the kind of financial jargon that makes normal people's eyes glaze over. But here's the thing. She forgot that we shared a Netflix account, and Netflix has this adorable little feature that shows you what's being watched and when. So while Clara was supposedly crunching numbers and building PowerPoint slides until 11 at night, Netflix was showing that someone was binge-watching Emily in Paris from her profile at the exact same time. Now, I'm no detective, but even I could figure out that you can't simultaneously analyze pension fund allocations and watch subtitled romantic comedies about fashion-obsessed Americans in France. That's when I started paying closer attention to the details, and sweet Jesus, the details were everywhere once you knew where to look. Like how Clara suddenly developed this passionate interest in fitness. Not just any fitness, mind you, but specifically the kind that required her to go to the gym at weird hours when normal people were either at work or asleep. She'd leave the house at 10 in the morning, claiming she was going to meet her trainer and wouldn't come back until 3 or 4 in the afternoon. When I'd ask how her workout went, she'd launch into these elaborate descriptions of her training routine that sounded like she'd memorized them from a fitness magazine. But here's what really gave it away. Clara hated exercise. In our entire 8-year marriage, the most strenuous physical activity I'd ever seen her do was walk from the car to the front door while carrying shopping bags. She complained when she had to take the stairs instead of the elevator. She once called an Uber to go 4 blocks because she didn't want to mess up her hair by walking. And now suddenly she's this fitness enthusiast who needs 4-hour gym sessions 3 times a week? Yeah, right. And I'm the Queen of England. So I started following her, which sounds creepier than it actually was. I wasn't hiding in bushes with binoculars or anything that dramatic. I just happened to be in the neighborhood when she was heading to her gym sessions. And wouldn't you know it, her route never actually went anywhere near a gym. Instead, it went straight to the Marriott downtown, where she'd disappear into the parking garage and not come out for hours. That's when I started taking pictures. Not because I'm some kind of voyeur, but because I knew that if this whole thing went south, which it obviously was going to, I'd need proof that would hold up when lawyers got involved. So I got myself a decent camera with a zoom lens, nothing too fancy, just something that could capture clear images from a reasonable distance. The money shots came on a Tuesday afternoon when Clara was supposed to be meeting with elderly clients about their estate planning. Instead, she was meeting with Darren in the hotel parking garage, and they were doing a lot more than discussing investment strategies. I got photos of them getting out of separate cars, photos of them going into the hotel together, and, because I'm nothing if not thorough, photos of them coming out 3 hours later looking like they'd just participated in some very non-professional activities. But the visual evidence was just the appetizer. The real feast was the audio recordings I'd been collecting from Clara's increasingly careless phone conversations. See, Clara had this habit of taking calls in what she thought were private spaces, like the bathroom or the back porch, apparently under the impression that I was too stupid or too uninterested to eavesdrop. What she didn't know was that I'd invested in some pretty sophisticated recording equipment, the kind that could pick up conversations through walls and windows with crystal clear quality. The conversations with Darren were absolute gold mines of incriminating information, not just the obvious affair stuff, although there was plenty of that. I'm talking about detailed discussions of their sexual encounters, complete with commentary on my supposed inadequacies as a husband. Clara would describe our bedroom, or lack thereof, if we're being honest, in terms that would make a porn star blush, always with this tone of superiority, like she was some kind of sexual expert who was tragically married to an amateur. "He hasn't touched me in months," she told Darren during one particularly charming conversation. And honestly, I'm grateful. It's like being married to a piece of furniture that occasionally asks what's for dinner. But my personal favorite was when she called me a charity case with a receding hairline and the sexual prowess of a sedated sloth. I mean, the receding hairline was a low blow. Genetics aren't exactly a choice. But the sedated sloth comparison was actually kind of creative. Points for originality, Clara. The recordings revealed that this affair had been going on for over 6 months, with detailed plans for weekends away, discussions of what they'd do once Clara figured out how to get rid of the deadweight, and even conversations about moving in together once she'd extracted herself from this disaster of a marriage. What really got me, though, were the recordings where Clara wasn't just cheating on me. She was actively mocking everything about our relationship to her friends. Phone calls with her sister Irene where she'd laugh about how I used to be somebody, but had really let himself go since losing my job. Conversations with her work friends where she'd describe me as basically a glorified house sitter who occasionally remembers to take out the trash. One particularly brutal recording captured Clara telling a group of her girlfriends that staying married to me was like keeping a pet that's outlived its usefulness, but you feel too guilty to put it out of its misery. The way they all laughed at that comparison was like getting kicked in the gut by someone wearing steel-toed boots. But here's the thing about being married to someone for 8 years. You learn to read between the lines, and Clara's lines were practically spelling out her entire game plan in neon letters. She wasn't just having an affair. She was systematically planning to destroy me while positioning herself as the victim of a failed marriage to a loser who couldn't provide for his family. The voice notes I'd recorded revealed her strategy in painful detail. She was going to wait until I found another job, then immediately file for divorce, claiming that my period of unemployment had put an irreparable strain on our relationship. She'd already consulted with a lawyer, without telling me, obviously, about how to maximize her settlement while minimizing any responsibility for supporting me. What she didn't realize was that every conversation she had, every lie she told, every cruel comment she made was being carefully documented and stored in multiple locations. I had backups of backups, copies stored in safe deposit boxes, and digital files uploaded to secure cloud servers that would survive a nuclear apocalypse. By the time I was finished collecting evidence, I had enough material to write a book about marital betrayal, complete with photographs, audio commentary, and detailed timelines of every lie, every affair, and every moment of calculated cruelty that Clara had inflicted on our marriage. She thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but what she didn't realize was that I'd been playing an entirely different game, one where patience and preparation beat arrogance and assumption every single time. As I sat in my home office that afternoon, organizing all this evidence into neat little folders labeled with dates and descriptions, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. Clara thought she was so smart, so careful, so superior to her stupid, unemployed husband. But every move she'd made, every lie she'd told, every cruel word she'd spoken had been carefully documented by the very person she'd dismissed as too pathetic to matter. The USB drive I created that day, labeled for when it's time, contained enough evidence to destroy not just our marriage, but Clara's entire carefully constructed image of herself as the successful, ethical, put-together woman everyone thought they knew. It was my insurance policy, my nuclear option, and my guarantee that when this whole thing went down, I wouldn't be the one left standing in the wreckage wondering what the hell had just happened. If there's one thing I learned from 8 years of marriage to Clara, it's that she valued her public image more than oxygen itself. This woman would literally rather suffocate than be caught looking less than perfect in front of the neighbors. Her entire identity was built around being the successful, charitable, put-together wife that everyone else wished they could be. She was like a walking Instagram filter, carefully curated and designed to make other people feel inadequate about their own lives. Clara's Sunday routine was a masterpiece of calculated virtue signaling. Every week, she'd wake up early to do her hair and makeup, because God forbid she show up to church looking like a normal human being who'd just rolled out of bed. She'd put on one of her carefully selected, modest but fashionable outfits, the kind that said, "I'm a good Christian woman who also happens to have impeccable taste and probably spends more on a single blouse than you make in a week." At St. Matthew's Episcopal, Clara was practically royalty. She volunteered for every charity drive, organized the annual bake sale, and somehow managed to work her professional success into every conversation without making it sound like bragging. "Oh, I'd love to help with the budget committee," she'd say with false modesty. "I do work in financial planning, so I might have some insights." It was like watching a performance artist whose medium was humility and whose canvas was other people's insecurities. The other church ladies ate it up with a spoon. Clara was their success story, the woman who proved you could have it all: the career, the marriage, the perfect house, the charitable heart. They'd gather around her after service like disciples around a guru, hanging on every word of wisdom about time management and work-life balance. If they only knew that Clara's idea of work-life balance involved screwing her coworker during lunch breaks and then coming home to insult her husband over dinner. But church was just the opening act for Clara's public image tour. The real show happened at community events, where she could really let her fake personality shine. Our neighborhood association meetings were like Clara's personal TED Talks, where she'd hold court about property values and community standards while somehow managing to mention her BMW, her job at a prestigious financial firm, and her recent vacation to whatever trendy destination was Instagram-worthy that month. She had this way of volunteering for committees that made it seem like she was doing everyone a huge favor by gracing them with her presence. "Well, I suppose I could chair the holiday decorating committee," she'd say, like she was sacrificing her precious time for the greater good instead of desperately seeking another platform to showcase her superiority complex. The neighbors loved her, of course. Who wouldn't love someone who organized beautiful events, always brought expensive wine to potlucks, and made everyone else's contributions look pathetic by comparison? She was the kind of neighbor who made property values go up just by existing in the vicinity, the one whose Christmas light display was so elaborate it probably showed up on satellite imagery. But here's the thing about being married to someone for 8 years. You get to see what happens when the cameras stop rolling. And what happened when Clara thought no one was watching was absolutely fucking disgusting. I had recordings of her mocking the pastor's wife, Mrs. Henderson, a sweet woman in her 70s who'd been nothing but kind to both of us since we started attending St. Matthew's. Clara would imitate her slight lisp, laugh about her tragic fashion choices, and make cruel jokes about how the poor woman probably hadn't gotten laid since the Carter administration. "Did you see what she wore to the potluck?" Clara would say to Darren during their phone calls. "I swear she shops at the same store as my grandmother, and my grandmother's been dead for 5 years." She was even worse about our neighbors. The Johnsons next door, who'd always been friendly and helpful, were regular targets of Clara's vicious commentary. She'd record voice messages for Darren describing Mr. Johnson as a wannabe handyman who couldn't fix a paper cut with duct tape, and Mrs. Johnson as a desperate housewife who thinks bringing me cookies will somehow make us friends. The fact that Mrs. Johnson had baked those cookies because she knew I'd lost my job and thought we might need some kindness during a tough time just made Clara's cruelty even more revolting. But my personal favorite was when she talked about her own mother, a woman who'd worked 2 jobs to put Clara through college and had never asked for anything in return except the occasional phone call. Clara described her as a burden I have to deal with, complained about the modest Christmas gifts she sent, and actually said, and I have this recorded, "I swear to God, if she moves in with us when she gets older, I'm putting her in the cheapest nursing home I can find and pretending I don't know her." All of this venom, all of this casual cruelty toward people who'd done nothing but show her kindness, was carefully documented in my growing collection of evidence. But unlike the financial fraud and the affair documentation, this stuff was pure character assassination material. This was the kind of evidence that wouldn't just destroy Clara's career, it would destroy her entire social standing in every community she'd worked so hard to infiltrate. That's when I decided it was time to start sharing some of Clara's private thoughts with the people she'd been talking about. Not all at once, and not in a way that could be traced back to me. I was going for maximum impact with plausible deniability, like a surgical strike on Clara's reputation that would leave her wondering who'd betrayed her trust. The church committee was the perfect place to start. I created an anonymous email account, thanks again to Malik's tech expertise, and sent a carefully edited audio clip to the church secretary, Mrs. Patterson. The clip featured Clara's greatest hits about Mrs. Henderson, including the comment about her fashion choices and a particularly vicious impression of her trying to lead the children's choir. I included a note explaining that I was a concerned parishioner who felt the committee should know what one of their volunteers really thought about the community. For the neighborhood association, I went with a different approach. Instead of audio, I compiled screenshots of text messages where Clara had shared photos of our neighbors' houses and made cruel comments about their landscaping, their car choices, and their general existence. The Johnsons' cookie-bringing kindness was mocked as desperate social climbing, and the elderly couple across the street were described as basically corpses who forgot to die. I sent these screenshots to the association's group chat from a burner phone, making it look like someone had accidentally forwarded them to the wrong group. "Oops, sorry, meant to send this to someone else," was all the message said, but the damage was immediate and devastating. Within hours, my phone started buzzing with messages from neighbors and church members. "Is this real?" they wanted to know. "Did Clara really say these things?" The audio clips and screenshots were spreading faster than gossip at a high school reunion, shared from person to person with the kind of shocked fascination that comes from discovering your golden child is actually a sociopath. Mrs. Patterson called me directly, her voice shaking with hurt and confusion. "I don't understand," she said. "Clara always seemed so nice, so supportive. Was she really making fun of Mrs. Henderson this whole time?" I played dumb, of course, expressing my own shock and disappointment while secretly celebrating the fact that Clara's carefully constructed image was crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. The neighborhood group chat exploded with comments ranging from disbelief to outrage. The Johnsons stopped by personally to ask if I'd heard the recordings, their faces showing the kind of hurt that comes from discovering someone you tried to help actually despised you. "We always thought Clara was so sophisticated," Mrs. Johnson said sadly. "We never imagined she was laughing at us behind our backs." But the real masterpiece was what happened at church that Sunday. Word had spread through the congregation faster than a wildfire in August, and the atmosphere was thick with whispered conversations and sideways glances. Clara, completely oblivious to the social apocalypse that was brewing around her, walked in wearing one of her usual church outfits, ready to play her role as the perfect Christian woman. Except this time, nobody was buying it. The usual crowd of admirers who normally surrounded her after service kept their distance like she was carrying some kind of contagious disease. Mrs. Henderson, bless her heart, still tried to be polite, but you could see the hurt in her eyes when Clara approached her with that fake smile and asked about the upcoming charity drive. "Oh, I think we have enough volunteers, Mrs. Henderson said quietly, which in church lady speak translates to "go fuck yourself" with a rusty spoon. Clara's confusion was visible from across the room, her carefully practiced smile faltering as she realized something had shifted in her social ecosystem. The coup de grace came when Pastor Williams approached her after service with a concerned expression that usually preceded difficult conversations about spiritual guidance. "Clara, we need to talk," he said, and you could practically see the blood drain from her face as she realized that whatever was happening was serious enough to warrant pastoral intervention. By the time Clara got home that afternoon, her phone was buzzing with notifications from social media, text messages, and missed calls from people whose opinions she actually cared about. Her perfectly curated world was falling apart in real time, and she had no idea why or how to stop it. But this was just the beginning. The church and neighborhood stuff was like softening up the enemy before the real attack. I'd shown Clara's community who she really was when she thought nobody was listening, but I hadn't even started on the professional consequences yet. That was coming next, and it was going to make her social humiliation look like a gentle warm-up for the main event. As I watched Clara pace around the house that evening, frantically trying to figure out how her private conversations had become public knowledge, I couldn't help but appreciate the poetry of it all. For years, she'd used her public image as a weapon against me, making me feel small and inadequate by comparison to her social success. Now that same public image was becoming her weakness, the very thing that would make her fall from grace so much more spectacular and painful. You know what's beautiful about living in the digital age? Information travels faster than a celebrity breakup rumor, and once something goes viral, trying to stop it is like trying to stop a freight train with a pool noodle. Clara was about to learn this lesson in the most spectacular way possible, and I had a front row seat to watch her perfect little world explode into a million pieces across every social media platform known to mankind. By late afternoon, the church and neighborhood drama was just the warm-up act for the main event. While Clara was still trying to figure out how her private conversations had leaked to our local community, I was already 3 steps ahead, preparing to launch her humiliation into the stratosphere of internet infamy. This wasn't going to be some small-town gossip that would blow over in a few weeks. This was going to be the kind of viral destruction that follows you around like a digital scarlet letter for the rest of your natural life. Malik had been waiting for my call all day, and when I finally rang him up, I could practically hear the excitement in his voice. "Please tell me it's showtime," he said, and I could picture him cracking his knuckles like some kind of digital warrior preparing for battle. Malik wasn't just good with computers. He was the kind of guy who could make your life appear or disappear from the internet with the same ease most people use to order pizza. "It's showtime," I confirmed, and within minutes, Malik was at my house with a laptop bag that looked like it could launch a space shuttle. "Dude, I've been looking forward to this ever since you told me what that witch did to you," he said, setting up what looked like a mobile command center on my kitchen table. "She's not going to know what hit her." The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. We weren't just going to leak Clara's private conversations to a few people and hope they'd spread naturally. We were going to weaponize social media itself, using every platform, every algorithm, and every viral mechanism to ensure that Clara's true personality reached the maximum number of people in the shortest possible time. Malik had created a network of burner accounts across Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and even LinkedIn, because apparently, professional humiliation deserved its own special platform. Each account had a different digital fingerprint, different posting patterns, and different follower networks to make it look like the information was coming from multiple independent sources rather than one coordinated attack. "The key," Malik explained as his fingers flew across the keyboard like he was playing a piano concerto, "is to make it look organic. We're not just dumping everything at once. We're creating a narrative that builds momentum as it spreads." The first wave started on Facebook, where Clara had the largest and most engaged audience. We began with the audio clips of her mocking Mrs. Henderson and the other church ladies, but we didn't just post them raw. Malik had edited them into short, easily shareable clips with captions that provided context. Local financial advisor caught mocking elderly church members. And is this how Alder and Finch employees really feel about their community? The reaction was immediate and visceral. Clara's Facebook friends, most of whom were either co-workers or people from church, started commenting with shock and disappointment. "I can't believe this is real," wrote one of her work colleagues. "This doesn't sound like the Clara I know," posted another, though you could tell from the tone that they were starting to question exactly how well they actually knew her. But Facebook was just the appetizer. The real feast was happening on TikTok, where Malik had created a series of videos that combined Clara's audio recordings with video footage of her at church and community events. The contrast was absolutely devastating. Watching Clara smile sweetly at Mrs. Henderson during a charity event, while simultaneously hearing her voice mocking the woman's appearance and intelligence, created a cognitive dissonance that was impossible to ignore. The TikTok videos were labeled with hashtags like hashtag two-faced, hashtag churchlady, and hashtag fake charity, and they started gaining traction faster than a cat video during a pandemic. The algorithm picked them up and started showing them to people in our area, then to people with similar interests, then to anyone who'd ever searched for content about workplace drama or religious hypocrisy. "Holy shit," Malik said, refreshing the view counts every few minutes. "This one just hit 10,000 views, and it's only been up for an hour." The comments are absolutely brutal. And they were. TikTok users don't mess around when it comes to calling out perceived hypocrisy, and Clara was getting roasted harder than a marshmallow at a Boy Scout campfire. "This is why I don't trust people who volunteer for everything," one comment read. "She's literally the reason trust issues exist," said another. "Imagine being married to this psychopath," wrote a third, which hit a little too close to home, but was also weirdly validating. Twitter was where things really started to pick up steam, though. Malik had crafted a thread that told Clara's story in digestible, retweetable chunks, complete with audio clips, screenshots, and context that painted a picture of systematic cruelty disguised as community involvement. The thread started with "Thread, local charity volunteer, caught on tape mocking elderly church members she claims to help," and spiraled into a devastating expose of Clara's two-faced behavior. The Twitter thread was getting retweeted by local news accounts, community watchdog groups, and even some minor celebrities who lived in the area. Each retweet expanded the reach exponentially, carrying Clara's humiliation to audiences she'd never even heard of. Within hours, hashtag Clara the Church Fraud was trending locally, and people were quote tweeting the thread with their own stories of encountering fake charitable types. But the real nuclear option was LinkedIn, where Clara's professional reputation lived and breathed. Malik had posted the financial fraud evidence, the recordings of Clara bragging about skimming money and defrauding clients, with a professional tone that made it sound like a concerned industry whistleblower was exposing unethical practices. "Financial advisor at Alder & Finch caught admitting to client fraud" was the headline, and it spread through professional networks like wildfire. Clara's LinkedIn connections, her coworkers, industry contacts, and potential clients were sharing and commenting on the post with increasing alarm. "If this is real, this is a serious violation of fiduciary duty," wrote one financial planning expert. "How did this person pass the ethics requirements for certification?" asked another. The professional pile-on was swift and merciless, with Clara's industry reputation getting demolished in real time. By 5 o'clock, my phone was buzzing nonstop with notifications from people tagging me in posts, asking if the viral content was about my wife, and expressing shock that they'd known Clara personally. The local news had picked up the story, and reporters were already calling Alder & Finch for comment about their employees' recorded admissions of fraud. "Dude, check this out," Malik said, showing me his laptop screen. "The story just got picked up by that financial industry blog with like 500,000 subscribers. Clara's about to be famous in all the wrong ways." The beautiful thing about social media is that once something reaches critical mass, it becomes self-sustaining. People were finding the content on their own, sharing it with their networks, and adding their own commentary that kept the momentum building. Clara's humiliation had become entertainment for thousands of strangers who were dissecting her character like she was a particularly fascinating train wreck. Instagram was where the visual evidence really shined. Malik had created posts that showed Clara at various community events with overlay text featuring her actual quotes about the people she was pretending to care about. The contrast between her public smile and her private venom was so stark, it looked like a psychological study in human duplicity. The Instagram posts were getting thousands of likes and hundreds of comments, with people sharing their own experiences with fake volunteers and two-faced community members. Clara had become the poster child for performative charity, The cautionary tale that parents would tell their children about the importance of genuine kindness versus calculated image management. But perhaps the most damaging platform was Nextdoor, the neighborhood social network where Clara had spent years building her reputation as the perfect neighbor. The posts there were being seen by everyone in our immediate area. People who'd interacted with Clara personally, who'd been on the receiving end of her fake kindness, who'd always had a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right about her too-perfect persona. The Nextdoor comments were particularly savage because they came from people who knew Clara personally. "I always thought there was something off about her," wrote one neighbor. "She seemed too good to be true," and apparently she was. Another neighbor shared a story about how Clara had volunteered to help with their elderly mother, but then never followed through, leaving them scrambling to find alternative care. By the time the sun started setting, Clara's digital destruction was complete. Her name was trending on multiple platforms. Her face was attached to viral content across the internet, and her reputation was being dissected by thousands of strangers who'd never met her but felt qualified to judge her character based on her own recorded words. The beautiful irony was that Clara had created this situation entirely by herself. Every cruel comment, every mocking impression, every admission of fraud had come directly from her own mouth. I hadn't fabricated anything, hadn't exaggerated or taken anything out of context. I'd simply given Clara's own words the audience they deserved. As Malik packed up his equipment and prepared to leave, he clapped me on the shoulder with the satisfaction of a job well done. "That," he said, "was a masterpiece of digital justice. Clara's about to walk into a shitstorm that makes Hurricane Katrina look like a light drizzle." And he was right. By the time Clara came home from work, she was going to discover that her entire carefully constructed life had been exposed, examined, and found wanting by more people than she'd ever met. Her phone would be buzzing with notifications, her inbox would be flooded with messages, and her professional contacts would be distancing themselves faster than passengers on a sinking ship. The best part? This was all just the opening act. The social media firestorm was devastating, sure, but it was also just the setup for the real destruction that was coming. Because while Clara was dealing with her viral humiliation, the compliance board at Alder and Finch was reviewing my anonymous report, and that was going to hit her where it really hurt, right in the career she valued more than human decency. There's something almost zen-like about watching your carefully laid plans come to fruition, especially when those plans involve the complete and total destruction of someone who's spent years treating you like garbage. As I sat at our dining room table, well, technically my dining room table, since the house was in my name, sipping my coffee and watching the clock tick towards 7 o'clock, I felt the kind of peace that usually comes from meditation or really good drugs. The coffee was perfect, by the way. French roast with just a splash of cream, brewed in the expensive machine Clara had insisted we needed because presentation matters even at home. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using her pretentious coffee setup to caffeinate myself for what was about to be the most satisfying conversation of our 8-year marriage. My phone had been buzzing all afternoon like an angry hornet trapped in a mason jar, but I'd been ignoring it with the kind of discipline that would make a Buddhist monk proud. Every notification was another piece of evidence that Clara's world was imploding in spectacular fashion, but I didn't need to check social media to know how bad things had gone. The steady stream of cars driving slowly past our house told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly her reputation had been nuked from orbit. Around 6:30, I heard the familiar sound of Clara's BMW pulling into the driveway with more aggression than usual. The engine revved harder than necessary. The car door slammed with the force of someone who was having the worst day of their professional life, and her heels clicked against the walkway with the rapid-fire intensity of machine gun bullets. But I didn't move from my spot at the table, didn't rush to the window to see what kind of state she was in, didn't prepare myself for the inevitable confrontation that was about to unfold. Instead, I took another sip of coffee and admired how the evening light was filtering through the kitchen window, casting everything in this golden glow that made even our outdated backsplash look almost artistic. The front door exploded open like Clara was being chased by zombies, followed by the sound of her purse hitting the floor and what was definitely her favorite designer shoes being kicked off with enough force to leave marks on the wall. I could hear her muttering something under her breath as she stomped through the house, probably a string of profanity that would make a sailor blush. When she finally appeared in the doorway of the dining room, Clara looked like she'd been through a blender set on Destroy Everything. Her perfect makeup was smeared from crying. Her hair was disheveled in a way that suggested she'd been running her hands through it in frustration, and her usually immaculate business suit was wrinkled like she'd been wearing it for a week straight. But what really got me was her eyes. For the first time in years, maybe ever, Clara looked genuinely scared. Not angry, not indignant, not superior. Just terrified in that primal way that happens when your entire world suddenly stops making sense and you realize you have no idea how to fix it. Everything is ruined, she said, her voice cracking like a teenager going through puberty. My job, my reputation. Darren won't even answer me. What's happening? She was clutching her phone like it was a life preserver, but from the way she kept staring at it with horror, I could tell it wasn't providing much comfort. Probably because every time she looked at the screen, she was seeing more evidence of how thoroughly her life had been demolished in the span of a single afternoon. I took another slow sip of my coffee, savoring both the flavor and the moment. For 8 years, Clara had held all the power in our relationship. She was the successful one, the respected one, the one everyone admired and wanted to be around. I was just the supportive husband who paid the bills and tried not to embarrass her at social functions. But now? Now the tables had turned so completely that it was like watching a master chess player suddenly realize they'd been playing checkers the whole time while their opponent was playing three-dimensional chess with pieces they didn't even know existed. You slapped me at 7 a.m., I said, my voice as calm and steady as if I was commenting on the weather. By 7 p.m., you got your answer. The words hung in the air between us like a confession at a murder trial. Clara's face went through about 17 different expressions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, realization, disbelief, and finally, pure terror as the implications of what I'd just said started to sink in. What? What do you mean? She stammered, but we both knew she already understood exactly what I meant. The woman who'd spent years calling me stupid had just figured out that her supposedly clueless husband had been playing a game she didn't even know was happening. I set my coffee cup down on the table with deliberate precision, making sure the bottom made contact with the wood in a way that produced a soft but definitive click. It was such a small sound, but in the silence of that moment, it might as well have been a gavel falling in a courtroom. I said, maintaining that same eerily calm tone, that you've spent months thinking you were married to an idiot who couldn't possibly understand what you were really doing. You thought I was too stupid to notice your affairs, too weak to do anything about your lies, and too pathetic to ever fight back. Clara's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. She was probably trying to figure out how to spin this, how to turn herself back into the victim and me back into the villain. But for once in her life, Clara was completely out of clever responses and manipulative tactics. You have recordings, she whispered, and it wasn't a question. It was the horrified realization of someone who'd just discovered that every cruel thing they'd said in private had been carefully documented by the very person they'd been talking about. I have everything, Clara, I said, and the simplicity of that statement seemed to hit her harder than if I'd screamed or thrown something. Every affair, every lie, every time you mocked me to your friends, every illegal thing you've done at work. All of it. Recorded, documented, and distributed to exactly the right people at exactly the right time. She collapsed into the chair across from me like someone had cut the strings holding her upright. For a moment, she looked less like the successful, put-together woman everyone thought they knew and more like a scared child who'd been caught doing something terrible and didn't understand how the adults had figured it out. Why? She asked, and there was something almost pathetic about the way she said it, like she genuinely couldn't comprehend why someone might want revenge after being treated like dirt for years. Because, I said, finishing the last of my coffee and setting the empty cup down with the same deliberate precision, you made one crucial mistake. You assumed that patience was the same thing as powerlessness. You thought that silence meant acceptance. You confused kindness with stupidity and restraint with weakness. I stood up from the table, smoothing down my shirt in a gesture that was probably more casual than Clara could handle given the circumstances. And most importantly, you forgot that the person you were destroying still had feelings, still had intelligence, and still had the capacity to fight back, when pushed too far. Clara was staring at me like she was seeing me for the first time, which in a way, she probably was. For 8 years, she'd seen me as an extension of herself, a supporting character in her story, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Now she was getting her first real look at who I actually was when I stopped playing the role she'd assigned me. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at her for a long moment, taking in her destroyed makeup, her terrified expression, and her complete inability to understand how she'd ended up in this position despite having orchestrated every single event that led to it. "Now," I said, heading toward the kitchen to rinse out my coffee cup, "you get to find out what it feels like to have your life completely out of your control, just like I did for the past 8 years. If I thought Clara looked like hell the night before, she looked like hell's unloved stepchild the next morning. I woke up around 7, force of habit from years of employment, and found her sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled business suit, her phone clutched in her hands like a lifeline to a world that no longer wanted anything to do with her. She'd clearly been up all night, probably refreshing social media feeds and watching her reputation get annihilated in real time by thousands of strangers who'd never met her but felt qualified to judge her character based on her own recorded words. Her makeup had migrated to various parts of her face in abstract patterns that would have been artistic if they weren't so pathetic, and her hair looked like she'd been electrocuted by her own anxiety. "I called in sick," she said without looking up from her phone, her voice hoarse from what I assumed was a combination of crying and screaming into pillows. I can't go in there today. Everyone's seen those videos. Everyone knows." I poured myself a cup of coffee from the machine. The same expensive setup Clara had insisted we needed because presentation matters even at home, and settled into the chair across from her with the casual ease of someone who'd had the best night's sleep in years. Because honestly, knowing that justice was finally being served had been better than Ambien for helping me achieve quality rest. "I'm sorry," Clara continued, and those were 2 words I'd been waiting 8 years to hear, though the context wasn't quite what I'd imagined. "I know I was horrible to you. I know I said terrible things, did terrible things. But we can fix this, right? We can work through this." The desperation in her voice was almost uncomfortable to witness. This was a woman who'd spent years treating me like an inconvenient roommate she couldn't wait to evict, and now she was practically begging for forgiveness like I was her last hope for salvation. Which, to be fair, I probably was. "I'll stop seeing Darren," she said, finally looking up from her phone with eyes that were red-rimmed and puffy from crying. "I'll quit my job. We can move somewhere else, start over. I'll be better, I promise. I'll be the wife you deserve." It was almost touching, in a pathological kind of way. Clara was offering to become the person she should have been all along, but only because her current version had been exposed as a fraud and destroyed beyond repair. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she'd been caught. "I've been thinking," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee and savoring both the flavor and the moment, "about what you said yesterday morning. About me living here for free." Clara's face went through several expressions: confusion, hope, and then dawning horror as she remembered exactly what she'd said and probably started to guess where this conversation was heading. "I was angry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean it. You know I didn't mean it. This is our house, our home. We built this life together. Actually," I said, pulling out a folder I'd prepared the night before while Clara was having her social media meltdown, "that's not quite accurate. See, I did some research yesterday, went through some old paperwork, and I discovered something interesting." I opened the folder and spread the documents across the table like I was dealing cards in the world's most expensive poker game. House deed, mortgage papers, property tax records, insurance documents. All of it clearly showing that the house Clara thought she could kick me out of was actually mine and mine alone. "The house deed," I said, pointing to the relevant document, "has always been in my name. Just mine. Not both of ours. Not some romantic joint ownership situation. When we bought this place 5 years ago, you were still in school, still building your credit, still basically unemployable according to the bank standards." Clara stared at the paperwork like it was written in ancient hieroglyphics, her brain apparently unable to process the legal reality of her situation. But we're married. What's yours is mine, right? Community property. That's adorable," I said, gathering up the documents and sliding them back into the folder. But community property laws are a little more complicated than that, especially when it comes to assets acquired before marriage or purchased with separate funds, which this house was. The truth was even sweeter than I'd imagined it would be. Not only was the house entirely mine, but Clara had never contributed a single penny to the mortgage, the down payment, or any of the major improvements we'd made over the years. She'd been so focused on building her career and spending money on herself that she'd never bothered to invest